On the majestic slopes of Mount Parnassus, in a place that the ancient Greeks considered the physical and spiritual center of their world, stood the sanctuary of Apollo. This location was not chosen at random. According to myth, it was here that the supreme god Zeus released two eagles from opposite ends of the earth, and they met in Delphi, thus marking the navel of the earth, the omphalos. The stone symbolizing this center was kept in the temple as one of the greatest relics, the point of contact between the world of gods and the world of humans. Delphi was not just a temple complex, but a complex organism, an international center where pilgrims flocked from all over the oikumene, from the shores of Spain to Colchis. The central figure of this sacred place was Pythia, a priestess prophetess. Contrary to popular belief, this was not a single immortal being, but a position held in turn by different women, often simple peasant women, chosen for their impeccable reputation. The ritual itself was performed with the utmost solemnity. Before the prophecy, Pythia bathed in the waters of the Castalian spring, drank from the sacred stream of Casotida, and, chewing laurel leaves, descended into the Adaton, the inner chamber of the temple, inaccessible to outsiders. There, sitting on a high tripod above a crevice in the rock, she inhaled the vapors rising from the bowels of the earth. Under their influence, the priestess fell into an altered state of consciousness. Her speech became incoherent, and she shouted out individual words and phrases, the direct, unprocessed voice of the god Apollo. This is where the priest prophets came in. It was they, educated and politically savvy people, who listened to Pythia's mutterings and gave them form. They clothed the prophecy in hexameter, the poetic meter of the epic, creating those famous ambiguous and metaphorical answers. Thus, the system was multi-layered. The Pythia's divine inspiration passed through the filter of human interpretation by the priests, which allowed the oracle to maintain its authority for centuries. Virtually any free person who could pay for the ritual and make a sacrifice could consult the oracle. The questions asked were very diverse. Kings and strategists asked about the outcome of wars and the founding of colonies. A simple merchant from Corinth might ask whether his sea voyage to Egypt for grain would be successful, and an Athenian landowner might ask whether he should marry his daughter to his neighbor. This accessibility to different strata of society made Delphi a national institution. The authority of the oracle was so high that no important state affair, whether it was the adoption of laws or the declaration of war, began without its approval. It acted as the supreme arbiter in disputes between city-states. Its decisions prevented bloodshed, and its blessing legitimized power. The fragmented and perpetually warring Greek world found in Delphi the only indisputable center of power, based not on weapons but on faith in the divine word. Perhaps the most classic example illustrating the fatal ambiguity of Delphic prophecies is the story of the Lydian king Croesus. In the middle of the 6th century BC, Lydia was at the height of its power, and its ruler was renowned for his untold riches. However, a new power was gaining strength in the east, the Persian Empire, under the leadership of Cyrus the Great. Sensing the threat, Croesus decided to act preemptively. But before challenging such a formidable opponent, he, as befitted a wise ruler, decided to enlist divine support. Being a pragmatist man, he was in no hurry to trust the first sanctuary he came across. Croesus arranged a grand test of all the famous oracles of his time. He sent messengers with the task of asking the oracles what King Croesus was doing at that very moment, 100 days after their departure from the capital, Sardis. Most of the oracles gave vague or incorrect answers. Only the answer from Delphi struck the messengers to the heart. The Pythia said, "I smell lamb and boiled turtle, covered with copper beneath and copper above." On that day, Croesus, wanting to come up with the most unimaginable activity, was indeed boiling turtle and lamb meat in a copper cauldron. Convinced of the truth of the Delphic voice, Croesus sent the most generous gifts to the temple: gold and silver ingots, bowls, statues, and asked his main question: should he go to war against the Persians? The answer he received went down in history. Crossing the river Halys, Croesus will destroy a great kingdom. Taking this as an unambiguous omen of victory, blinded by pride and faith in his own luck, the king gathered an army and invaded Persian lands. The result was catastrophic. His army was defeated, his capital fell, and he himself was taken prisoner by Cyrus. Only then, standing at the edge of his funeral pyre, did Croesus realize the true meaning of the prophecy. The great kingdom he had destroyed by crossing the border river was his own. This story is not just a tale of the fall of a king. It is a fundamental lesson about the nature of Delphic prophecies. They never gave direct guidance for action, but always offered food for thought. The responsibility for interpretation, and therefore for the consequences, always lay with the individual. The fate of the Athenians during the Greco-Persian Wars was completely different, when wise interpretation saved an entire nation. In 480 BC, the giant army of the Persian king Xerxes invaded Greece. After the heroic but tragic defeat of the Spartans at Thermopylae, the way to Athens was open. Panic gripped the city. The Athenian envoys, in despair, went to Delphi. The first response from Pythia was one of the darkest and most hopeless in the history of the oracle. She predicted the complete destruction of the city by fire and iron, advising the Athenians to flee to the ends of the earth. The envoys were devastated. However, one of the priests, sympathizing with their grief, advised them to return to the sanctuary in a posture of supplication and ask the oracle for a second, more merciful prophecy. So they did. The new answer was no less mysterious, but it offered a glimmer of hope. Only wooden walls does Zeus Tritogenius give to stand unshakable in salvation for you and your descendants. Returning to Athens, the envoys read the prophecy before the popular assembly. Fierce debates ensued. The elders and conservatives insisted that the wooden walls were the ancient wooden palisade that once surrounded the Acropolis. They called for fortifying the citadel and holding the defense. But the strategist Themistocles, a far-sighted and cunning politician, had a different vision. Long before the invasion, he had persuaded the Athenians to invest the proceeds from the silver mines not in handouts to citizens, but in the construction of a fleet of 200 triremes. Now he passionately argued that the wooden walls given by the gods for salvation were the ships. He persuaded his fellow citizens to take an unprecedented step: to leave the city to be plundered by the enemy, evacuate women, children, and the elderly to the island of Salamis, and have all able-bodied men board the fleet. This risky plan worked. The Persians burned empty Athens, but their huge and unwieldy fleet was lured into the narrow straits off Salamis, where the maneuverable Greek triremes inflicted a crushing defeat on it. The victory at Salamis was a turning point in the war. Thus, the correct interpretation of a vague saying, backed up by the strategic genius of one man, saved not only Athens, but the entire Greek civilization from enslavement. Delphi's influence was not limited to the military and political spheres. The oracle played a key role in the formation of Western philosophy, unwittingly giving impetus to Socrates' mission. The story began with a simple question asked by an ardent admirer of the philosopher, Chaerephon. Upon arriving in Delphi, he asked Pythia, "Is there anyone in the world wiser than Socrates?" The answer was short and categorical: no one. When Chaerephon relayed these words to Socrates, he was genuinely astonished. He, a man whose credo was to acknowledge his own ignorance, was named the wisest? Socrates took this not as a compliment, but as a divine riddle that he had to solve. He decided to test the words of the god in practice.
The philosopher began to systematically walk around Athens, engaging in dialogue with those who were considered wise, politicians, poets, craftsmen. He asked them questions that seemed simple at first glance about the essence of justice, courage, and goodness. And each time he discovered the same thing. Their confidence in their own knowledge was illusory. When confronted with his meticulous questioning, their definitions crumbled, revealing internal contradictions and ignorance. In the end, Socrates came to the conclusion that the oracle was right. His wisdom lay not in possessing some kind of sacred knowledge, but in recognizing the limits of his knowledge, in that famous, "I know that I know nothing." Meanwhile, others mistakenly believed that they knew everything. Thus, the Delphic prophecy became the catalyst that transformed Socrates from a simple Athenian eccentric into a gadfly who stung and awakened his fellow citizens from intellectual slumber, and laid the foundations for his dialectical method, which formed the basis of all subsequent European philosophy. The oracle also acted as the supreme legislator, blessing and legitimizing entire state structures. The most striking example is the reforms of Lycurgus in Sparta. According to Plutarch, when Lycurgus conceived of radically restructuring Spartan society, turning it into a militarized camp, he went to Delphi. The Pythia not only approved of his plans, but called him beloved by the gods and said that his laws would be the best in the world. Having received such a divine mandate, Lycurgus returned to Sparta and carried out his harsh reforms, establishing the famous Spartan age, a system of education, communal meals called civilisation, and iron discipline. The authority of Delphi was so great that no one dared to challenge the laws that had received the direct approval of Apollo. Thus, the oracle became the godfather of Spartan militarism. No less important was the role of Delphi in the process of the great Greek colonization of the 8th–6th centuries BC. No ship with settlers set sail to found a new colony without first consulting the oracle. Pythia indicated the location for the new settlement, gave advice on organizing the expedition, and even appointed the oikist, the leader of the colonists. The history of the founding of the city of Cyrene in Libya, modern-day North Africa, is particularly illustrative. The inhabitants of the island of Thera suffered from 7 years of famine and drought. Their king, Battus, who also suffered from a stutter, went to Delphi to seek advice. The Pythia gave an unexpected answer. He must found a colony in Libya. Battus, having neither the resources nor the desire to set off for unknown lands, ignored the prophecy. But the disasters on the island did not stop. The Phrygians sent envoys to Delphi a second time, and again received the same order. And again they did not comply. Only when their island had finally fallen into decline did they equip an expedition. After several unsuccessful attempts to land on the coast, they finally founded Cyrene, which over time became one of the richest and most prosperous cities in the Greek world. And Battus himself, according to legend, was cured of his stutter. This story demonstrates that Delphi acted as a kind of planning center, directing surplus populations from overpopulated cities to develop new territories, thereby reducing social tension and expanding the Greek world. The procedure for consulting the oracle was a complex and strictly regulated ritual that turned the journey to Delphi into a true pilgrimage. The journey to the sanctuary was a trial in itself. The roads were dangerous, and the sea voyage was unpredictable. Upon arriving in Delphi, pilgrims entered a completely different world. They ascended the sacred way, which wound its way up the mountainside. On both sides of the road stood treasuries, small temple-like buildings constructed by various Greek city-states, Athens, Sipnos, Corinth. They contained gifts presented to the oracle in gratitude for successful prophecies. These treasuries were not just warehouses for valuables, but a form of political demonstration. Richly decorated, they testified to the power and piety of their city, conducting a silent dialogue with pilgrims and with each other. Before asking a question, the questioner had to undergo a purification ritual. He washed himself in the waters of the Castalian spring, then paid a fixed fee, called a pelenos, and sacrificed a goat or sheep. An important part of the ritual was sprinkling the animal with cold water.
If it shuddered with its whole body, it was considered a favorable sign. The god was ready to answer. If not, the questioner was refused and had to wait until the next day. The order of questions was determined by lot, but some polis or noble families, for special services to the sanctuary, were granted the right of promontia, the opportunity to ask the oracle out of turn. This was a huge privilege. Finally, after going through all the stages, the person entered the temple and conveyed their question to the priests, formulating it on the special tablet, usually in a form requiring a yes or no answer.
They had no direct contact with Pythia. They waited outside until the priests brought them a poetic answer written on the same tablet. The whole atmosphere, the difficult journey, the grandeur of the architecture, the complex rituals, the long wait, put people in a special frame of mind, causing them to receive the answer with reverence and awe. How did the priests manage to maintain such authority and give predictions that so often came true when interpreted correctly? Modern historians believe that behind the mystical facade lay one of the most effective intelligence networks of antiquity. Delphi was the crossroads of the world. Information flowed here from all corners of the oikumene. The priests communicated with ambassadors, merchants, warriors, and travelers. They knew about political intrigues in Athens, the impending uprising in Ionia, dynastic disputes in Syracuse, and grain prices in Egypt. This huge array of data was carefully analyzed. The priests were highly educated, insightful people with a deep understanding of psychology and politics. They could compare facts, see trends, and make very accurate predictions. And then they would clothe them in a vague, poetic form that allowed for multiple interpretations. It was a win-win strategy. If the prediction came true, the oracle's fame grew. If not, the blame fell on the questioner, who had misinterpreted the signs given by the gods. However, nothing lasts forever. The golden age of Delphi passed along with the classical era of Greece. With the rise of Macedonia and then Rome, the political landscape changed. Greek city-states lost their independence, and matters of war and peace were no longer decided in their assemblies. The center of power shifted. The Romans, being pragmatic people, treated the oracle with respect, but without the former awe. They turned to it, but more as an ancient tradition than as a supreme arbiter.
In 86 BC, the Roman commander Sulla, needing money for the war with Mithridates, plundered the treasuries of Delphi without hesitation. Later, emperors such as Nero took hundreds of statues from the sanctuary to decorate their palaces. At the same time, people's worldview was changing. The spread of philosophical skepticism and rationalism undermined belief in the old gods. But the decisive blow was dealt by Christianity. The new religion saw the oracle not as the voice of God, but as the machinations of demons. Its authority declined, and pilgrims became fewer and fewer. The last attempt to revive the former glory of Delphi was made in the 4th century AD by Emperor Julian, nicknamed the Apostate for his desire to return to paganism. He sent his physician Oribasius to Delphi to find out about the fate of the sanctuary. The answer he received became the epitaph of the entire ancient civilization. The Pythia uttered her last prophecy, filled with deep sorrow. "Tell the king, the decorated palace has fallen. Phoebus has no shelter, no laurel for prophetic divinations. And the spring no longer murmurs, and the talkative fountain has fallen silent." Shortly thereafter, in 393, Emperor Theodosius I the Great, establishing Christianity as the only state religion, banned all pagan cults. The Temple of Apollo was closed and eventually destroyed. The voice that had shaped history for thousands of years fell silent forever. As for Pythia herself and her trance, for a long time it was believed that stories about pneuma, divine vapors, were nothing more than myth. Archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries found no fissures beneath the ruins of the temple.
However, in the late 1990s, a group of scientists led by geologist Gel de Boer discovered that the Temple of Apollo stands at the intersection of two geological faults. Analysis of water from nearby springs and travertine deposits in the temple itself revealed the presence of light hydrocarbon gases, in particular ethylene. In small doses, ethylene causes a state of euphoria, detachment, and visions similar to that described by ancient authors. Thus, the ancient myth has a perfectly scientific explanation. The Pythia may indeed have inhaled psychoactive gases that put her into a trance, and the priests, using her incoherent speech as raw material, created prophecies that changed the world. The Delphic phenomenon is a unique intertwining of geology, religion, subtle politics, and a deep human need to glimpse the future. It is a story of how a crack in the rock on a mountainside became a source of power that shaped the destinies of empires. Her life was shrouded in mystery and subject to the strictest ritual. One was not born a Pythia, one became one. Contrary to later romanticized notions, in the classical era, it was not young maidens who were chosen for this role, but mature women, often simple peasant women from the Delphic community who had families and children. The main criteria were an impeccable reputation and a calm disposition. From the moment of her election, her earthly life was over. She took a vow of chastity, severed ties with her family, dressed in simple clothes, and became a living vessel for the divine voice. It was not so much an honor as a heavy burden. Ancient sources, in particular Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi, describe cases when Pythia, sensing something bad, resisted and did not want to go down to the Ataton. Once, the priests forced her to give a prophecy, and she, uttering inhuman cries, fell into a rage and died a few days later. This shows the enormous physical and psychological strain her body was under. She was not an omnipotent seer, but rather a victim, an instrument in the hands of the deity and the priests who served him. The psychological impact on the questioner began long before he heard the answer. The journey to Delphi itself was an act of faith. This was followed by a series of rituals designed to break down skepticism and open the mind to the divine. The anticipation, excitement, sight of majestic treasuries, smoke from altars, singing of hymns, all this created tremendous emotional tension. In this state, a person became extremely receptive to any signs. The ambiguity of prophecies was not a flaw, but a brilliant psychological mechanism. It did not provide a ready-made solution, but forced the questioner to launch a powerful process of self-analysis. He replayed the vague phrase over and over again in his head, applying it to his fears, hopes, and secret desires. Ultimately, he himself found in it the meaning that was closest to him and acted accordingly. It was a kind of projective psychotherapy of antiquity. The oracle did not predict the future. It forced people to create it themselves, being absolutely sure that they were following the will of the gods. The self-fulfilling prophecy effect worked. The king who was predicted to win acted more boldly and decisively, which led him to success. However, this ideal picture of neutrality and divine wisdom has repeatedly cracked under the pressure of harsh political reality. Despite its sacred status, the sanctuary was an active player in the political arena, and its priests understood perfectly well whose side power was on. The most famous case of direct bribery and manipulation was the overthrow of tyranny in Athens at the end of the 6th century BC. The powerful aristocratic family of the Alcmaeonids, expelled from Athens by the tyrants Pisistratids, found a cunning way to return to power. In 548 BC, the old temple of Apollo burned down. The Alcmaeonids, being very wealthy, took on the contract to rebuild it. According to the contract, they were supposed to build it out of limestone, but they showed generosity and faced the facade with expensive Parian marble. This service was not altruistic. In return, the priests of Delphi did them a favor. Every time the Spartans, the most powerful warriors in Greece, consulted the oracle on any matter, be it the harvest or internal affairs, Pythia invariably added the same phrase at the end: first of all, free Athens. At first, the Spartans, bound by ties of hospitality with the tyrants, ignored this call. But the divine command, repeated over and over again, broke their will. In the end, they decided that the will of God was more important than alliances with men, sent an army, and expelled the tyrants. Thus, the Alcmaeonids returned to Athens, and their leader Cleisthenes laid the foundations of Athenian democracy. History is paradoxical. Democracy in Athens was born thanks to corruption and political manipulation of Greece's most sacred institution. To protect its status and untold riches, Delphi needed military and political protection. This function was performed by the Delphic Amphictonian, an ancient religious and political union of 12 Greek tribes living around the sanctuary. The members of the union swore never to destroy each other's cities, never to cut them off from running water, and to jointly defend the temple of Apollo from any encroachments. Violation of this oath was punishable by the declaration of a holy war. There were several such wars in Greek history, and they were fought with particular cruelty. For example, during the First Sacred War in the early 6th century BC, the city of Chrysa, whose inhabitants robbed pilgrims and tried to impose a tribute on the sanctuary itself, was completely destroyed, its land cursed, and its inhabitants exterminated. Amphictonian was a kind of prototype of the UN, where Delphi played the role of headquarters and the priests played the role of the Security Council.
Control over Amphictyone gave enormous political influence. That is why the strongest powers, such as Philip II of Macedon, Alexander's father, fought for it. Having secured a seat on the Amphictyone Council, he transformed himself from a regional king into the legitimate leader of all Greece, which paved the way for further conquests. Delphi was not only a spiritual center, but also, in modern terms, the first international bank and financial regulator of the ancient world. In an era of constant warfare and the absence of reliable storage systems, the temple, protected by divine fear and the swords of the Amphictyone, was the safest place for savings. States and individuals from all over Greece and beyond kept their treasures in Delphi. These were not only precious metal ingots, but also works of art, expensive weapons, and other valuables. The priests acted as bankers. They accepted deposits, issued loans at interest, and could even finance large state projects, such as the construction of a fleet. The wealth accumulated in Delphi was enormous. This made the sanctuary a tempting target. Despite the fear of divine retribution, it was plundered several times. During the Third Sacred War, the Phocians used the temple's treasures to hire a huge army, which made them the hegemons of Greece for several years. Later, as already mentioned, it was plundered by the Roman Sulla, and Emperor Nero took about 500 bronze statues from there. The economic power of Delphi was both a source of their influence and a cause of their vulnerability. In addition to global issues of war and peace, the oracle performed a vital social function. It was the highest authority in matters related to miasma, or ritual impurity. Bloodshed, especially of a relative, was considered a terrible crime that defiled not only the murderer, but also the entire land on which he lived. Such a person became an outcast, pursued by the Furies, goddesses of vengeance. The only way to be cleansed and return to society was to receive forgiveness from the god Apollo at Delphi. The mythological archetype of such purification is the story of Orestes, son of Agamemnon. Having killed his mother Clytemnestra to avenge his father, he incurred the wrath of the Furies. Tormented by their persecution, he arrived in Delphi. It was Apollo, through his oracle, who showed him the way to redemption, commanding him to stand trial in the Areopagus in Athens. This myth reflected real practice.
Delphi offered rituals and procedures that allowed murderers, especially those who committed the crime unintentionally or for a valid reason, to remove the stain of guilt and reintegrate into society. Thus, the oracle acted not only as a prophet, but also as a high priest, maintaining moral and ritual order in the Greek world. However, even at the height of its power, the oracle was not immune to mistakes and obvious bias. During the Peloponnesian War, the greatest intra-Greek conflict between Athens and Sparta, Delphi openly took a pro-Spartan position. This was not surprising. Sparta was the stronghold of the Dorian tribes, who traditionally patronized the sanctuary, while Ionian Athens, with its democracy and rationalism, aroused the suspicion of the conservative priesthood. Before the war began, the Spartans asked the oracle if the god would help them. The answer was unequivocal. He will help even if he is not asked. Throughout the war, the predictions were unfavorable for the Athenians. This obvious partisanship undermined Delphi's status as a pan-Hellenic supra-political center. The Athenians began to treat its prophecies with distrust, and more often turned to other oracles, such as the oracle of Zeus at Dodona. Not all predictions concerned great empires. Many of them determined the fates of individuals and small groups, becoming the starting point for amazing adventures. Such is the story of the founding of the colony of Tarentum, modern-day Taranto in Italy. During the long Messenian War, Spartan women, whose husbands had been away on campaign for decades, gave birth to children fathered by helots, or young warriors who did not participate in battles. These children, called parthenoi, sons of virgins, were not recognized as full citizens. When they grew up, they conspired, but their plot was uncovered. Instead of executing several hundred young and strong men, the Spartan authorities sent their leader, Phalanthus, to Delphi. The Pythia gave him a strange answer. "I grant you Satyrion, and you will live in the fertile lands of Tarentum and become a scourge to the Gepidae." Having received divine guidance, the Parthenians went to Italy, founded a prosperous colony there, and indeed became a scourge for the local tribes. Thus, the oracle solved an acute social problem by directing a potentially dangerous element of society to colonize new lands. The thirst for certainty in a chaotic world has not disappeared since ancient times. We no longer turn to Pythia, who inhaled volcanic vapors, but the Delphi model itself lives on today. The role of priest interpreters is now played by political analysts, stock market gurus, military experts, and strategy consultants. They operate with huge amounts of data, our version of the Delphi intelligence network, build complex models, our rituals, and issue forecasts that are often couched in terms of probabilities and scenarios, the modern equivalent of ambiguity. And corporate and state leaders, like ancient kings, are forced to interpret these prophecies and make decisions based on them, the cost of which can be enormous. The Delphi phenomenon reminds us of the eternal human desire to find a simple answer to a complex question, and how easily belief, authority, and correctly presented information can shape reality.
The god of Apollo has fallen silent, but his principles for working with human consciousness have proved immortal. In addition to questions of war and peace, the temple of Apollo itself served as a constant moral compass for the Hellenic world. Its pediment bore not threats or promises, but two of the greatest aphorisms of Greek wisdom: "Know thyself," and "nothing in excess." These maxims turned pilgrimage into an act of self-analysis. They suggested that the true purpose of turning to God was not to receive a ready-made answer, but to better understand oneself and one's place in the cosmos, to find harmony and avoid destructive pride, hubris. The oracle was not so much a predictor as a moral judge. Herodotus tells the instructive story of the Spartan Glaucon, who was entrusted with a large sum of money by a friend. When his friend's heirs demanded the money back, Glaucon went to Delphi with a cunning question:
Could he keep the money by backing up his lie with an oath? Pythia's answer was devastating. She predicted that for the mere thought of deception, his entire family would be exterminated. Glaucon returned the money in horror, but the prophecy came true. His family soon died out. The lesson was clear. For Apollo, not only a bad deed is sinful, but also the very intention, the very question that calls into question honor and justice. The god was not willing to speak every day. Prophecies were given strictly according to schedule, only on the 7th day of the month, considered Apollo's birthday, and only during the 9 warm months of the year. In winter, as the Greeks believed, the god left Delphi and flew to the land of the Hyperboreans, and silence reigned in the sanctuary. This limitation created huge queues and incredible excitement. The fate of the world was decided in the order of a living queue, determined by lot, unless the city or ruler had the precious privilege of promantia. But Delphi was not only a place of anxious anticipation.
Every 4 years, the Pythian Games were held here, second only to the Olympic Games in prestige. But unlike Olympia, where only athletic strength was honored, in Delphi there were also competitions in the arts. Kithara players, flute players, and poets competed in glorifying Apollo Musigites, the leader of the Muses. The sanctuary was filled with music and poetry, and on the slope of the mountain stood a magnificent theater that could accommodate thousands of spectators. This turned Delphi into a real cultural forum, where the power of words and the harmony of sound were valued no less than political acumen. However, the aura of infallibility and impartiality was tested more than once. During the first Persian invasion, Delphi showed cowardice which many Greeks considered treason. The first prophecies given to Athens and Sparta were full of horror and advised not to resist the invincible enemy. This gave rise to accusations of Medism, sympathy for the Medes, i.e., the Persians. It is likely that the priests, with their intelligence network, simply assessed the odds realistically and bet on the winner. Only after the Greeks showed unexpected resilience did the tone of the prophecies become more patriotic. An even more sensational scandal was the story of the Spartan king Cleomenes I. Wanting to get rid of his co-ruler Demaratus, Cleomenes bribed influential Delphians, who, in turn, persuaded Pythia to give a false prophecy, declaring Demaratus to be illegitimate. The deception worked, and Demaratus was expelled. But the truth eventually came to light. The priestess involved in the intrigue was disgraced and stripped of her office, and the reputation of the oracle was seriously damaged. It became clear that the divine voice could be subject to very earthly vices, such as corruption and political manipulation. But it was not only kings and generals who sought answers in the shadow of Parnassus.
Ordinary mortals from all corners of the Hellenic world brought their personal troubles and hopes to the foot of the temple. A childless couple asked how to have children. A farmer who had lost his cattle wanted to know where to look for them. A merchant setting off on a risky voyage prayed for a sign as to whether he would return with a profit. The answers to such everyday questions were often simple and practical. Appease the nymphs, make a sacrifice to Heracles, search east of your home. These small prophecies, which did not change the course of history, were nevertheless the basis of everyday faith. They gave people comfort, hope, and a sense of connection to the divine order. The very nature of Delphi reinforced this feeling. The temple was located at the foot of 2 giant cliffs, the Pythia, or Shining Ones, which glowed with crimson fire at sunset. According to legend, sacrilegious people were thrown from these cliffs. The sound of the sacred Castalian spring, where pilgrims performed ablutions, mingled with the echoes that echoed through the gorge. The entire landscape was imbued with a formidable primal power, forcing even the most hardened skeptic to feel the presence of something greater than himself. In such a place, any word spoken by a priest in the name of God took on the weight of indisputable truth. The Delphic oracle is not just a page from a mythology textbook. It is a powerful historical phenomenon that teaches us how faith, information, and psychology can control the masses and shape the future. Ambiguous prophecies forced leaders to think, analyze, and take responsibility for their decisions because misinterpretation led to disaster. Perhaps the main lesson of Delphi is not to seek ready-made answers from higher powers, but rather the call carved on the pediment of the Temple of Apollo, which is still relevant today. Know thyself.